And so we've got Mark Mills here coming in through cyberspace, Manhattan Senior Institute Senior Fellow, Faculty Fellow at McCormick School of Engineering at Northwestern. Those who don't know, Northwestern is one of the top schools in America, but also a founding partner of Cottonwood Ventures, which focuses on digital energy technologies. And if anybody understands, it takes energy to run digitization, and there's no getting around that. There's a real synergy there. Mark is a regular contributor to none other than Forbes magazine and writes for the City Journal, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and recognized in so many circles around there. But early in his career, he actually did real work as a physicist, developmental engineer in the field of microprocessors, fiber optics, and missile guidance. Probably in the Navy, we used your missiles. And then he went on to serve in the White House Science Office. People don't know it. There's an Office of Science Technology Policy, hugely influential under President Ronald Reagan, who ended the Cold War. Talk about out-of-the-box thinking. And so he's written several books in addition, builds things, builds companies, and writes books, Digital Cathedrals and the Work in the Age of Robots, before it was fashionable to talk about this stuff. And has won the American Energy Award of the Writer of the Year, Encounter Books. I know Mark doesn't want to hear all this, but we got to brag about you. And the Cloud Revolution, writing about the cloud before people understood what the cloud was about. And then I can't see if Sean is up there. I know Sean personally. He's been building what North Dakota has as the CIO of North Dakota, but also a tech visionary of North Dakota. Before that, he was at the Mayo Clinic, which is one of the massive, medical establishments, in America. And then the builder and founder of several companies. I'm paraphrasing you, if it's okay, Sean. And then he's the CEO of Bit Zero North American operation here in North Dakota. So thank you for joining us today. How I want to do this, if I can, I'll just give you each about 5 to 7 minutes to say what you want, if you want to do that, before we jump into some questions about the topic of this ChatGPT and policy implications, which could be government, could be state, federal, could be corporations. If you want to, you could take policy down to nonprofits, whatever you want to go with there. But Mark, do you mind if I start with you and you go ahead and take 5 to 7 minutes? Is that all right?
Sure. Thanks for having me. And, you took my 5 minutes reading a bio that nobody cares about. John does real work, and I just talk about people that do real work now. So it's a transition in life. I do some real work, I suppose. Well, there's a lot in my book about artificial intelligence and not ChatGPT specifically, because they're one of many projects and engines that employ algorithms that we call AI. I suppose I should start with something I've said many times, but I'll say it here again. It's in my book, is that I have a problem. I'm not alone in the computing world with the term artificial intelligence, because it causes alarm and misdirection and misunderstanding of what the tools are, what they really do. And we know where the term came from. Professor McCarthy, I think 56, I think the first meeting at Dartmouth, and he was looking for a phrase that would get attention, and it worked, and it still works. But artificial intelligence is like calling a car an artificial horse, as I've said before, or an airplane an artificial bird. There are such things as artificial horses and artificial birds, but they don't work very well. And replicating the functionality in some fashion of flying and driving is a big deal. That's why it's called an automobile. Automobility is the autonomous feature, which meant self did not mean a robot. Self meant you yourself could drive. You didn't have to be in a train or a ship that other people were driving. So we have this misnomer. Doesn't mean the tools are incredibly powerful. AI is a big deal. I've written about this, thought about it. A lot of people have. It is a big deal to bring productivity leverage to what we've traditionally called knowledge work instead of manual work is a big deal. So we're at the signal of a pivot. The pivot began a while ago, and it doesn't end with ChatGPT, which is fine. It's impressive. It sounds like I'm being denigrating and call it a parlor stunt. A lot of things that are being done with it right now, but most of what's being done so far the ChatGPT is parlor stunts as opposed to broad productivity gains. But it is a big deal, and it's causing the kind of conversations that we want to have about how to integrate it in education, into how to manage its downsides, risks, cybersecurity. The big risk, one big risk, is to have policymakers, regulators decide to step in at these nascent phases of utility. We have a long history of regulating things that are new, and for good reason. But the history of over-regulation is newer, just say. So count me in my study of the history of regulating technologies as being alarmed not by the technology, but by the instincts of regulators now to not only crush innovation, but to freeze innovation. So what regulations can do, a lot has been written about this, is lock things in time and make it hard to innovate, because regulators can only innovate what they know, and they don't know the future, and they don't innovate the future. They've never innovated the future, and they've never guessed the future right, ever. So because of that, when you start regulating in a ham-handed way at early stages, and we really are at the end of the beginning of AI as a tool, it's just beginning. This is a very bad time for heavy-handed, misguided regulation. It's a very good time, and this is where the history has been good about engineers in general, scientists to a lesser degree, and there's a distinction with a difference, having worked as both in my life, at self-regulation, at standards and professions that prevent risks. This is what physicians have done since the dawn of the medical profession. And this is probably a domain that really calls for the IEEE societies, related societies, to step up and begin to engage in best practices and all these kinds of things. Anyway, so I'm excited. It's great to have this debate now. Have everybody talking about AI. I couldn't get anybody to talk about AI 5 years ago. My book came out only a year ago, and there's lots about AI in it, why I'm enthusiastic about it, but it wasn't the part anybody wanted to talk about. They wanted to talk about electric cars, or windmills, or robots, which I love too. AI and robots are linked at the hip. Obviously, the functionality of physical automatons is deeply dependent on software, algorithms, AI, that is not doing calculations, but it's doing best approximations of how to operate, which is what humans do. So that's it sort of paints the picture of where my biases are, and sort of, if you like, where I begin with my biases on this whole domain.
Great. Well, thank you. And you have the physical stage, President Riley. Do you want to give a 5 to 7 minute thoughts on this? Because it can help prompt questions too. Because as I've watched these other panels, there's very few questions at the beginning, and then it begins to grow exponentially as things are being said. Very thoughtful questions, by the way. Go ahead. Over to you.
Sean is perfectly good.
If you can move close to the microphone so people online can hear you, because there's about 80 people. Oh, you have a microphone. Okay, sorry, I didn't hear you. Is the microphone on?
Everybody hear me?
I can't hear.
All right, beautiful. Is it not on? You guys can hear me.
It's getting better.
All right.
Now we can.
All right. Good deal. Turn me on. Beautiful. Well, I'm a little outgunned by Mark and Mark here, but so
Hardly. Come on.
So Chancellor Agrath calls me President Riley. My preferred title is IT guy. So I have been a CIO, a CMO, a CTO, a COO, and a CEO. But my favorite title was about 15 years ago. My daughter, prompted on by my wife, came and put a sign on my door that said Chief EIEIO, and that definitely worked in technology of all sorts and sizes across the world. And when it comes to policy in artificial intelligence today, so how many students do we have? A table of students over here, right? We have some other students through the room. So here's something for you guys to think about. So I get invited to legislators around the country. I get invited to come and testify to different things. And one of the groups that I just went and testified to, legislative body, was debating computer science and cyber science education, computer science and cyber science here in North Dakota as well. but they were debating computer science education. And one of the senators asked a question and he says, so artificial intelligence, we're using that in drones, right? We're killing people with that. Is that something we really want to be teaching our children? And you get some fun questions from legislators some days. And you look at them and you go, well, sir, so if it's threatening, do you want to not teach your children? I mean, if it's something that threatens your children, do you want to make sure they don't know about it? And we went through the whole thing, but no, it's not just for killing people on drones. It's used in education, and it's used in medicine, and it's used in automotive, and it's used everywhere. We're using it all the time today. Now, a lot of that AI that we're using today, you know, as Mark Mills said, it's, you know, it's kind of fancy magic and not so much fun when we see what's behind the scene. But there are really very good things that are happening there in today's world with AI that is doing really good stuff. And the problem is, from a policy standpoint, our legislators barely understand computer technology, much less the cloud, much less AI, you know, evolving technologies of all sorts and sizes. I've talked about genomics. We've talked about, you know, using CRISPR-Cas9 to be able to do some cool things, using the artificial intelligence to determine what CRISPR can do within certain biomes to be able to help give us a medication so that you could walk into a medical provider, give a swab, and the intelligence system can give you a design pill for you. How are we going to regulate that? Right? What happens if the AI makes a mistake? Is it the doctor's fault? Is it a programmer's fault? Is it maybe nobody's fault? Right? The liability aspect within policy is huge today. All of these concepts right now, we've seen multiple cases already. A Tesla car in Arizona has an accident. The immediate report publicly was that the Tesla was in auto drive and that the AI took it down the wrong direction. No, that may be true, that may not be true, right? That case is still in process. But all these questions around policy came because we immediately had a bill put into the Arizona legislature then to ban all auto drive cars. Because obviously they're not safe because we've had one accident. How many people died on the roads this year by humans? For those that heard my question earlier this morning, right? We keep expecting absolute precision and absolute perfection out of our intelligence system or our technology. Well, we don't have that expectation for us. And our policy is starting to reflect that. We're having now policy in some places in certain legislatures that are putting forth where they want absolute precision of that technology, even though the humans are nowhere close to that. So this is where it gets to be really fun. And as I look at students, right, you're going to be helping to form the mindset of these legislators. And if any of you are willing to put your hand up and say, hey, I'll go testify somewhere, please come talk to me afterwards, because I would love to be able to get some folks who are willing to talk to these guys. And more than just me, anybody prettier than me, please, would be wonderful. But it'd be great to be able to have this conversation. So Mark, I'll hand back to you and we can go from here. If you guys don't mind, I can stand.
Okay, great. So I'll throw some questions out, and then as the Q&A starts to populate, okay, I'm already seeing some. So I'll ask her one that they're asking about, well, what policies might be good. So let me ask one, because obviously Mark has shown that we can overregulate. In fact, as a historian of technology, Mark, you'll get a kick that one of the first books I had to read about the evolution of the railroads was Regulating Railroad Innovation. There was a play on the word of regulators, the idea of like, when we regulate the steam flow, we got to regulate the level of innovation. You know, so this has gone back a while, and you're right. We can truly gum up this process. But one of the issues out there is accountability, and there's this section 230 of Communications and Decency Code that has enlisted testimony on Capitol Hill and books about it, that early on in the internet's commercialization phase, we know it was created in October of 1969 on taxpayer money, but it's become a commercial sensation, a whole world. But there was this little line that released platforms from liability if something goes wrong, because the users are accountable, not the actual platform. And so the questions coming up with is ChatGPT do you think this technology essentially is a platform that should be protected by, this code, or is it something different? Are we going into something different where the AI, and I appreciate your comments that it's not artificial intelligence, we call it an intelligence. This machine intelligence could be held accountable for what it says. So, Mark, do you want to try it first, or do you want to? Anybody have a preference to take it first?
Sure. Well, to go back to your history analogy, the development of safety standards in engineering began with boilers, and the Boilermakers Association petitioned the government to create standards because there were no standards. People were being killed, not in theory, but hundreds of people a year in boiler explosions, not just on ships, ferries, but in buildings. And they needed standards, right? To create the safety. They didn't want the government creating the standards, so they didn't understand metallurgy. To Josh's point, you need to have some domain knowledge. So they basically organized around creating standards and then petitioned the government to regulate at the national level so that there'd be a consistent, like with the railroads, you had to have a track gauge was regulated. But back to this question of whether ChatGPT itself is subject to regulation different than other things. I think this is highlighting the Section 230 regulation question, which is, in my view, amplified by, it's not a ChatGPT question. It's a platform question. Do they deserve and should they have this form of protection? I think it's inevitable now that 230 is going to be revisited and reframed. I think it's inevitable because of what's happened. So if you look at data on where people get most of their news, right? You've got data telling us, surveys, that 2/3 of people get their news through social media, not through newspapers. Newspapers are not equally protected. They don't have the same form of protection. So what you have is a disparity that's evolved. It wasn't in place at the time of the creation of the internet. So I think this is going to get revisited. I worry a little bit about the revisiting. Governments usually do things that are, let's just say, non-ideal, but I think we're on that path. I think regulating AI at this juncture I think we'd all agree, it's not that the regulators, or more importantly, the politicians, don't necessarily have the domain knowledge to understand. Some regulators do. Some regulators are very smart. Some aren't so smart. I've met lots of regulators. I think the domain knowledge is higher, obviously, among regulators because they draw on industry expertise. But again, they aren't the leading edge. Although if they were, they wouldn't be regulating. They'd be innovating. It's just, I don't mean this as a slam against regulators. It's just the nature of the business, right? The risk takers and innovators are building, and the regulators are the ones that are sort of less innovative by definition. So they don't really see the future. So this is going to take professors and practitioners to participate in what nobody likes to do, which is testifying as witnesses before and talking to regulators and politicians to not only frame how the questions should be asked in terms of what people want. They want safety, whether it's cybersecurity safety, Josh's point about who's responsible. When we've got plenty of case law. I'm not a lawyer, but I've studied lots of the legal cases where technologies kill people and hurt people. There's plenty of case law that is applicable here, and I think directly applicable, but hasn't been tested yet. And when it gets tested, that's when we'll find out if we need new laws or not. I'm kind of in the category as I'd rather have the things tested with existing case law before we run out and create more laws. We've got a lot of laws in this country. That's where my bias lies. But that's kind of a messy process. Everybody wants a clean answer that this is what ChatGPT is. This is how we regulate it to make it perfectly safe. Obviously, nothing's perfectly safe. And it's so the old adage, the invention of the car is the invention of the car accident. Okay, we all know that, but it's true for all technologies.
So go ahead, Sean. Since you're a corporate executive trying to manage this space, thoughts?
Yeah, so essentially Section 230 allows you to say stupid things on Facebook. Yeah. And it allows you to say much stupider things on Twitter. And Twitter and Facebook don't typically get sued for the stupid things and stupider things you say. And that's basically essentially what Section 230 does.
Exactly.
When you start looking at how that applies to a ChatGPT and to these AI engines, part of the problem in the legal code is the legal code has a very hard time defining what things are to begin with, right?
Mhm.
A platform is something that they've been able to define in a big way, but these products right now, what actually is artificial intelligence? How do you define it in legal language to be able to say this is absolutely true or is not, right? A judge needs to be able to look at something and make a definitive decision, left or right, whichever way. And I don't mean politically, I mean just push it one side or the other to say, yep, this is in scope, this is out of scope. That part is what's really, really complicated today, because as a legislature works through a process, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, they work through a process that takes many years. So students, right? You guys are working in AI now, doing or getting or interested, just here to learn about the awesomeness. All right, so some of that. All right, so whatever you learn today, how pertinent is it 8 years from now? Not so much in the technology field. But from a legal standpoint, a law that gets proposed today,
Exactly.
having an 8-year term to get done is actually average, right? It can take it is average nationally 8 years to be able to get a law from actually into a committee through a process to get it signed. The technology curve 8 years ago, I mean, anybody got a cell phone that's 8 years old? Any of you even got a car that's 8 years old? I mean, I do once in a while, but I'm not driving one today, but I have a few. But I don't have a lot of 8-year-old tech, right? And this is part of the problem from a policy standpoint as well, is the legislative bodies who are writing regulations, who then are being enforced by the regulators. The regulators have much, much deeper knowledge in the subject because that's their day-to-day job. The legislators get thousands of things thrown at them they're trying to regulate or they're trying to manage. Then you get the federal regulators where they get to do this individually, but it also takes a long time to write those rules, and they have to have those rules vetted through different models. This is going to be a super complication. So as AI starts to impact the workforce, and I know that's the next panel, but give a moment for that. But as it starts to impact the workforce, how are we going to write regulation around that? What does that do for the social services systems? What does that do for a potential UBI, all of these different possibilities out there. So it's going to be fun to be able to see how this goes. But right now, Section 230, I'm not so worried about Section 230. I'm more worried about the definition of the technology and how that definition is being applied over the next, say, 3 years.
All right. We have a pretty heavy policy question. Before I get to that his heavy one, I'll take an intermediate one. I have a question teed up here I asked to think about, but I'll get back to that because that gets to maybe the definition thing. But for the two of you, is this truly a watershed? One of you mentioned FlexPoint or watershed, but is it really that? Because I'm still hearing from some people going, it's just another app, whatever. But is this truly a big event in history right now? Mark, do you want to start with that?
Well, historians love, and we all do the same thing. We always look at a time, a company, or a product as a pivot in history. And it's not unreasonable. I mean, there were smartphones before the iPhone, but the iPhone, as we all know, in 2007 changed the game because it was really the product that achieved what Palm Pilot and BlackBerry all tried to achieve. But there were smartphones around for quite a while. But the market took off as everybody imitated Apple, the design. So it's very elegant. So we have that true with cars. It's true with computers. And so I'd say we're at what ChatGPT and all the discussion we're having now is happening because we're more or less at that inflection, which is why I say we're at the end of the beginning, because it took a while for as high as a velocity as we all like to babble about. Things happen overnight. Well, we didn't get to 2007 smartphones overnight. It took a couple decades. And then real significant penetration was pretty fast, but it was a full decade. The radio was the same, by the way. The radio penetration from first commercial product to 80% of use in residences was faster than the smartphone. And it was a more expensive product in real terms than the smartphone. So consumers will adapt technologies at high velocity once they're perfected. AI is I think we're pretty close to it. But I think, to Sean's point, we have a real problem with what the word means. Not worse, because I think it's a misleading word, but what machine learning means. We do know what it's not. It's like that old adage, right? We know it's not computation, because we're not asking for a specific answer. When you have a computer do a spreadsheet, it only has one answer. It could be the wrong one or the right one, but there's not, it's just it. And what I try to tell people that the difference is that we moved into the era of inference, right? Whether it's driving a vehicle, you want to be about right, not perfect. Whether it's an X-ray reading, whether it's an essay, asking ChatGPT to do a sonnet, pretty good. B-, C+. It's not really original, but it's pretty good. It's different. So the inference function is different than the computation function. And in fact, you can do a lot of that in so many markets, so many different ways. But it's also like an app, because it's what's behind, it's the engine behind the app. The app is a hyper-specific tool. So I think we are at a watershed. I also think we're there also because I'm sort of a hardware guy more than I used to write code a long, long time ago, back in the ancient days. And I thought the previous panel had it right. It's a language. I used to do the language of APL because I liked it better. But I know that's, dates me. But the hardware inflection is also upon us. Even as excited as people are by NVIDIA's GPUs, and everybody has a GPU or a tensor processing unit, the domain of the silicon's functionality to do what we call machine learning and inference has reached an inflection that's really quite remarkable. The cost of inference, if you like, the cost of the processing you need has collapsed, and as a consequence, the use of it has grown faster than any other utility function in computing in history. We've seen the amount of compute resources devoted to doing machine learning increase 300,000-fold in 6 years. I mean, it's just breathtaking, and it's just beginning. I mean, I do a lecture. I put up a picture of the new Cerebrus chip, which is the size of a dinner plate, and has 3 trillion transistors on it, and one chip it processes images 24,000 times faster than the most powerful NVIDIA chip. And it's not a theoretical chip. It's already available in the cloud by the drink. It's limited accessibility, but it's changed the cost function of machine learning and inference overnight, not by 10% and not by 20%. This makes Moore's law pale by like 1,000%. 10,000% cheaper. It's staggeringly cheaper. So this is a big deal, right? This is an inflection. So we have this definition problem. So I'm worried about the rush. Like Sean, I don't think they're going to get any new law passed quickly. I don't want them to rush, frankly, because if I learned one thing a century ago in the White House Science Office about government and policy, going slow is our friend. The only time that's not your friend is an actual crisis, is a natural disaster. You got to get there quickly to help people. Otherwise, new laws, you don't want to be made overnight. The going slow is what we need right now. It'll allow innovation to flourish, but more importantly, we have a much better chance of making less bad laws. The laws won't be good. They'll just be less bad. So the slow part is good, but it is an inflection. And I think the anxieties are a reflection of the excitement. They're yin and yang, right? The anxieties are high because the excitement's high, and they're both happening because it is a big deal, and it will change fast. But and I'm in the camp that more good than bad comes from it. But there's no unalloyed good in any technology. My point about car accidents. So Sean and I are on the same page about the confusion on this is a risk, but it's also a plus. It'll confuse. It will slow and confuse the regulations and the policymaking, I hope.
So Sean, anything you want to add to his flex point or not in history?
Yeah, so look through history. Watershed moments come when a technology becomes commodity, right? And not everybody likes the term commodity, but what it basically means is it's a It's a process of making the technology widely available to the population, right? The automotive industry had 150 car manufacturers in 1899, right? And yet they had almost no penetration into the world until Henry Ford figures out a way to be able to commoditize cars, right? This has happened over and over and over in history, whether it be firearms and black powder and all these things, where it was a specialty technology that was really expensive. Somebody finds a way to be able to make a commodity version, and boom, all of a sudden you've got this moment where it's impacting the entirety of society. That's where we're sitting right now. When it comes to AI, a lot of this tech has been around for a while. It is getting vastly, vastly smarter. It is getting vastly, vastly better, and it is evolving immensely. But where ChatGPT changed the picture here just recently, right? What is it, 100 million people joining per month or whatever the app number is? I missed that part this morning. Sorry, I had another call. But I mean,
0 to 100 million in a month. Yeah.
Yeah, 100 million people joined in the first month. That's commoditization of a technology. It made it so much broader in its accessibility that now when I turned on my podcast this morning, so when my alarm goes off, my Google Assistant automatically kicks off a collection of things, right? Which in the old world, we would call that a cron job. Today, we call it AI, but it kicks off of things. And then one of those shows was The Economist. And The Economist this morning was all about artificial intelligence. And this is absolutely everywhere. And the reason it's everywhere is because now it's accessible. And that accessibility has become a watershed moment and will continue to be for a long time to come.
Yep. Agree.
So then, since we've established that, then I'll tee up two policy questions, and I'll get to the real hard one in here. So if it is this watershed, and if it, this world is emerging, cyberspace, Zuckerberg's metaverse, and now this machine learning AI thing, I've noticed that ChatGPT 4, you got to pay for that. Mm-hmm. So should a policy be not regulation, but promote wider use, meaning should the government basically subsidize so that everybody can have access to this tool rather than just people who can pay?
Well, I'll answer that because I'm a baby of Reagan. I was a child when I worked for Ronald Reagan, so you'll guess my answer. The governments can't subsidize everything. They shouldn't subsidize everything. And accessibility, where we are today, where we're going to go, came from the collapse in cost of something, its increase in utility value, which didn't come from subsidies. It came from technology progress. So if we want more of it and we want it to be cheaper, we don't know what the more of it exactly will be. We don't know what the market's going to want and use. So the government will, first of all, subsidize the wrong things, which they have a long track record of doing. There isn't an infinite supply of money. And when you try to create an infinite supply of money, it would be a whole separate panel. You create something that we all have experienced today called inflation. So there are special cases, and this education is often a special case, where you want to have access to resources that are difficult for people, especially students, to get access to. That would be computers, like supercomputers, which are subsidized on campuses. But most things, especially commodity things, to Sean's point, you don't get market penetration with subsidies, even though politicians like that. The car was not subsidized. Indeed, the car era, the radio era, the television era, we can pick them all. Computer era, the laptop era, the smartphone era. You can't even say that the Tesla got here because of subsidies, because even though people like to beat up on Elon Musk for the subsidies he has received, you can't explain the emergence of Tesla and its success on subsidies. It's just not explanatory. It's because the technology got better. And I'll go back to one thing. Governments do not have the wisdom, because most people don't, never mind governments, to know what to subsidize. So except for special cases, which I plead for, and they're the minority, tiny minority. No, the answer, that's a long way. No, please no, and stay away from.
Okay. All right, well, then I'm going to give Sean the hard question here from Dr. Mahalingam. And he references a book that was mentioned earlier. There's a guy named Yuval Harari who wrote several books. Bill Gates has endorsed him, his book Homo Deus, that sees artificial intelligence is actually part of human evolution. Since it's created by humans, it's a tool. et cetera. And so he says that in the past, policies have been driven by productivity, utility, maybe safety, relevance to economic activity. Is it right for us to focus on such things if, in fact, this is the next stage of human evolution, as Yuval Harari talks about? Do we need to think differently about this technology? So give it to you, Sean.
Yeah. So I could stand up here for like 3 hours talking about the human evolution aspect, and maybe we're in a matrix. And if we are,
Well, you have about,
totally need it,
you got 4 minutes,
oh.
4 minutes, 4 minutes.
4 minutes. All right. So let's think about this aspect of, is this necessarily part of the human evolution? And if I understand his question, his aspect is how do we ensure that this is, available for everybody and moving? Well, first of all, don't subsidize it. I'll go with that, right? Subsidize research, don't subsidize commodity. Subsidies and commodities break markets. When you break the market, you can't get it to people, right? Had we had a subsidy for this AI component 2 years ago, we would not be looking at ChatGPT today. It would not be in front of 100 million people. Why? Because you wouldn't have the capacity to be able to get it out to the masses. Allow it to evolve. Allow the technology to evolve. Is this part of our evolutionary process? Well, we are going to continue to think, and we're going to continue to learn. And if we're going to continue to do that, we're going to continue to master the universe around us. And part of mastering the universe around us is getting rid of low value work. Right. So one of the things AI is really good at, and if you want, I'll put this out there for a second. I have a TED Talk. Go watch my TED Talk on this. But artificial intelligence is replacing boring, mundane, repeating work that nobody wants to do. And when we get to the workforce topic here next, I'll give you a much better example. I don't want to take that out of that group here, but we're enabling people to provide higher value by getting rid of things you never wanted to do, right? How many of you want to go home tonight and wash clothes? Anybody excited about that? Anybody online? Yeah, there we go. I got one in the back. I'm excited to wash clothes. Now let's put you in the 1890s, and those clothes have to go to the river, and you need the old washboard, right? The only thing we use washboards for now is music, like Tennessee bluegrass, right? But in that time, it was an effort. It was a massive effort. It took massive amounts of time. We made washing machines to take away that work, right? Artificial intelligence is the same thing. We're just replacing different bodies of work. And so is this part of our natural evolution? Absolutely it is. But what we're doing is we're freeing ourselves from commodity work, because that's what AI is there for, is to replace things that are repeating, predictable, mundane, boring tasks. And so it is absolutely part of what we need to do and what we need to grow. And I hope I answered his question if I understood what you asked, Mark.
Yeah, I think so. Lots of good questions and thoughts here. So I'm going to give you a different one, Mark. Since I think both the panelists here don't want to regulate too much, so let's talk about the characterization of what's happening. Is this tool going to promote democracy, or is it going to promote concentration of power by those who have the patents and the codes? Because Bill Gates famously said about 3 years ago, it's getting time where we might need to tax the robots. We have the guy that ran for president, I forget, he that ran for mayor of New York, who talked about the universal basic income. Is this thing going to be more democratic or more concentrating in power? Mark, over to you.
Well, fundamentally more democratic. We just give the short answer is that's what it is, because anything, to Sean's point, that amplifies human labor, whether it's manual drudgery or whether it's intellectual drudgery, is democratizing. If it wasn't, then we wouldn't use backhoes, we'd use shovels, and we'd put people back in the fields with horses instead of tractors. The fact that it's mental drudgery seems weirder and different and scary to some people. But for people who read history, and I know Sean does because of his analogies and mine are the similar, people were very afraid of the first classes of machines and automation back in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And in fact, the idea of a universal basic income finds its roots in 1962 with President Kennedy and the Blue Ribbon Panel on the impact of automation on the workforce, specifically calling for a universal basic income, even though the economists on the panel concluded that one wasn't needed, but politically they felt compelled to call for it, because even though it caused net wealth net wealth increase, net job increase, the fact that specific workers in the automobile unions at the time, workers unions, were losing jobs, and there was a change in the workforce, they felt compelled to call for universal basic income, even though they knew it was the wrong answer. So it's a fascinating piece of history. We're repeating the old, history is rhyming here, not exactly repeating, because this time it's different. Yeah, of course, the technology, the tool's different, but the effect's the same. So it is a misdirection to think that we're gonna need to tax robots. In fact, I wrote then at the time, my book, Work in the Age of Robots, that Gates had it backwards. Now, he's a smart guy because he's rich. I get that. And I don't want to be mean because he gave a very nice endorsement for my book on energy years ago. So it's on the cover of the paperback, Bill Gates said, nice endorsement. So, but he was really wrong about robots. If you want to subsidize something, you should subsidize the damn robots. By that, I mean, give tax incentives, accelerated depreciation, which this Congress just took away, for investments in these automatons, because we don't have enough people. Our problem in the Western world is we're depopulating the workforce. We need the damn robots, not to tax them. We should pay companies to hire them. So that gets the whole logic backwards.
Okay, so here's a hot button one. I didn't write this, but I'll read it. Let one of you field this.
If it's hot button, I want to make Sean take the heat then.
Okay, so
I'm up.
being that censorship and diversity thought is basically, let's face it, it's going on, right? I mean, there's campuses just shutting people down, canceling people, throwing things. I mean, it's really sad what's happening at campuses. But Mark, they're not happening in North Dakota. Just so you know, this is a place of civility. We listen to liberal or conservative. But anyway, given this is happening, and that ChatGPT could begin to censor and be biased, how do we prevent identity politics from taking root basically through this technology, and the thin line between fairness and propaganda and thought policing? And on this point, I did ask ChatGPT to write the answer to a question was Donald Trump a moral man and was Joe Biden a moral man? And there was decidedly different output. I have to admit, I was surprised, and I'll let you speculate which way it leaned. But whoever wants to take that one, go ahead.
So I can start with that. So let's start with one level setting thing. So when we say ChatGPT or AI, people are thinking these of single entities of system, right? That is not in any way what we're dealing with, right? The implications of AI and the installs of AI will be in the thousands upon millions, right? Even in the organizations I work with, right, we have an artificial intelligence that helps in a fintech company that is using the exact same engine for something else that is doing data mining for something else that is helping to move heat energy from data centers into greenhouses to stop global warming, right? That same technology can be used in thousands of different ways. And we've got a lot of folks who are worried about specifically one app, or, they like the Facebook kind of conversations. Well, it says on Facebook must control this. Well, what happened? Well, people are like, well, we don't like Facebook. Let's open another social media, right? Young folk, my kids don't even have Facebook accounts. So like, that's for old people. We don't do that, right? They're on different platforms completely.
Right.
So first of all, is we have to realize is that we're not talking about a singular monolithic platform of artificial intelligence equals, right? It's all about how all of this is implemented across these massive different domains. Now, from this aspect of how do people look at it? So I won't ask you, Mark, what those answers were to those two questions, right? This person a moral man, is this person a moral man? You as a human being are going to look at those answers and say, well, this one's biased. how many people in this room would look at those precise same answers and say they're biased in the same way? Right? This is another one of these problems we have is that we have this expectation that our technology should agree with us because all the people around us agree with us, and because we've been in these echo chambers and our social media is giving us echo chambers, and those echo chambers are getting stronger and stronger. So obviously the technology should give us an echo chamber too. That's not necessarily the right way to operate, especially when the question I'm asking isn't necessarily about morality, but my question is something like, hey, can I help this person who has diabetes to be able to live a better life? And one person says, well, just tell the fat ass to exercise more, right? It's like, well, wait a minute, right? And the other answer is let's give them a medication, right? Those things are not as morally connected to us, right? But you've got the same problem in the output is, are we actually connecting to the real outputs of this technology? Are we actually helping people to get a real answer? And that's going to be a huge challenge for us going forward. Is that aspect of bias has been applied in all kinds of ways, and people tend to think of bias today in something that's racial, sex, gender, but there's all these other aspects of bias that we have to be aware of, and let the technology, again, democratize, as Mark said, let it democratize with real answers based on real data rather than giving us the answers we're looking for. And that's going to be a massive challenge when we're talking about millions and millions of different installations out there.
Well, the other thing, Sean's point is that is making the very incredibly important point that machine learning and AI, forget the ham-handed words, is a tool that's applied for different purposes, whether X-ray reading or driving a vehicle, or answering semantic questions, making predictions about movie watching. So the tools are hyper-specific, and whether they're useful or not, everybody in the computer world remembers the old adage GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. But now with ChatGPT, we maybe need a new one. Maybe it should be called BIBO, bias in, bias out, because humans write the algorithms, and the algorithms scrape human thought and writing, if you like, on what's out there to come up with answers. So by definition, you're going to have what we would call biased outputs because the inputs come from humans anyway.
And with the same thing with the algorithms, we also have the aspect of the data.
Exactly.
We sometimes are collecting the data based on what we believe the outcome is going to be.
Exactly.
And we're inputting that data. So we not only have the algorithm, but we also have the data. And this is part of the human problem, right? So I believe humans are actually very logical beings, right? A lot of people look at me and kind of cock their head and go, what? But I would say humans are very logical, but we are very, very bad at the variables, right? We're just very, very poor at gathering the information that goes into the logical assertion that we make. So when we make this assertion and we have an outcome, we've oftentimes cherry-picked the variables that meet what we're getting for an outcome. And that's still happening in AI because we've only given it access to pieces of variables instead of a comprehensive set of information. And that's going to be, again, just the continued challenge of all these systems.
Well, how about if I shift gears a little bit here? I know that both of you are kind of less for the regulations, which makes sense, perfectly sense, when you're just talking about improving incomes and allowing people to, improve their lives. But as an earlier panel mentioned, I was very impressed at the sophistication of just the students here. So I'm complimenting the students off screen. But somebody in the panel mentioned that Vladimir Putin said that whoever gets the breakthrough in AI will be the world's superpower. And China clearly believes this because they're investing enormous sums. I was the recent chair of the Second Navy's task force on education reform, and AI and robotics featured strongly. But there is an issue that if we're about to have an arms race, a destabilizing arms race that we've learned from the past, World War I was very strongly connected by many historians to the destabilizing naval arms race. When the Kaiser decided he wanted to compete with Great Britain, that's why they came in the war. Otherwise, the war would have been over in the first month. But once Britain came in to protect its naval supremacy, we led to the destruction of much of Europe. Then we had the nuclear arms race, which, Mark was in the Reagan administration and Ronald Reagan astoundingly stopped it. People thought it was going to end very badly, but there was nuclear arms controls before him, of course, but he really brought arms control to a great culmination. But arms control started when we almost blew up the world in 1962. Is there room or an argument for less civil regulation, less economic regulation, but the military needs to start looking at how to regulate, discuss, maybe even have arms control measures on what AI is allowed to do to another person's country? Thinking like the AI linked to cyber power could be the example. Mark,
I give a short answer is no. I was a Cold Warrior. So the analogies are not, there's a category error in analogies, I think, that are used, and they're commonly used. So I'm not criticizing you, Mark. I'm just saying this. I agree.
And I said my question. You can attack the premises. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So because AI is, as Sean has correctly pointed out, he's a practitioner. It's a category of capability that's as broad as the development of the electric motor or the steam engine or the computer itself. It's a new category. It's an inference category of silicon as opposed to a computation character of silicon, which is important, and it can be weaponized. So the car was weaponized. The internal combustion engine made tanks possible. The airplane, which made overnight mail, which was one of the first uses for it, by the way. The mail service is the first commercial use of airplanes. Let us drop bombs. So we have a long history of turning useful life-affirming technologies into weapons. This is not new. I happen to be on the camp that's closer to another article that my friend, Patrick McCloskey has in the latest issue of the Dakota Digital Journal from Don Howard on the ethical uses of AI in weapons. So the key here is not going to be international treaties about not using AI. It's being used. It's being used now. The drones fly used with AI assistance. We already have AI assisted targeting for all kinds of reasons. The issues of ethics in warfighting are very, very old, and this brings to the fore maybe a new debate about talking about the ethics of technology and warfighting. It's a challenging area, but it's real. But I don't think it's a special case, the equivalent of a nuclear weapon. I just don't see that as the case. We all have, it's not a weapon per se. Nuclear weapons were designed as a weapon specifically, based on obviously the advancement of a basic area of science. This is not an advancement in science per se. This is underlies a evolution in silicon. Anyway, I'm not in that camp. I think it's consequential. I do think we are at one of those other pivots, the rare so-called RMAs, revolutions in military affairs, where the kinds of tools that are available for protection and destruction change in materially significant ways and require us to think differently about warfighting. I think that's true. It really is true. Drones have been far more consequential and a bigger part of the Ukraine war than anybody really imagined. And this will probably be seen as the first drone war. The Gulf War I was seen as the first smart weapons war, and this will probably be the first drone war.
Well, Mark, I've got to really trump you with a reference here that Hugh Grant's latest film, Operation Fortune, is all about super AI. So, Hollywood thinks I'm on the right track.
Oh, no, Hollywood loves this. The rise of the Terminator, AI, and,
it's a comedy, just, Hugh Grant's movie is kind of a comedy.
I love science fiction. Dystopian science fiction is the best kind of science fiction there is.
Isn't it? Okay, so the thing about Sean, I'm going to compliment him now. I shortened his bio, but he and I were at a conference with Palo Alto in DC, and they let me be on the stage briefly. But the point I made, I might have stolen it from Sean, but for the first time since the Civil War, when states were on the front line, we now have states on the front line in cyber war. Literally, right. They have to protect their states. The federal government can barely protect itself. There's no cavalry coming. And Sean should have been wearing a sheriff's badge, and the governor should have had a general's badge. But John, you combine AI with cyber. Do you agree with Mark? There's no reason to have arms control? Or are we going to watch the utility grid get crushed in some third world country by AI before we do something about this?
So let me give you a physical world example, and then I'll move into the AI example. 1939 Nazi Germany Panzers were tracked, and they had a revolutionary track system that gave them the ability to be able to march across Europe, that gave them the ability to do the Blitzkrieg. That track system was actually engineered and developed by an American for tractors, right? He built the tracking system to make tractors more effective to be able to farm and grow food. And the Nazis took that and put it on their tanks and were able to make their tanks vastly more effective at warfare. The utilization of technology has always been this massive evolving thing. And today's world, from a cybersecurity standpoint, you mentioned Terminator for a second. The real world right now looks like Terminator versus RoboCop, right? That is really what the real world looks like right now, because it is a huge, huge number of fully automated, fully AI-driven, fully technical attacks that are being defended by fully AI, fully automated, fully technical defenders. All right. So from a technology standpoint, putting a limit on the tech itself isn't really where I would go. If you want to get in these conversations, I think from a world stage, and we want to look at the warfare component, my question is what is an act of war today? If I attack as an individual a power plant in Canada, and I knock a power plant off in Canada, is that an act of war? If a state actor knocks off that power plant, is it an act of war? It's the exact same result, it's the exact same outcome. Those are big questions right now. And we've seen this happen. So in 2014, the Russians' first major cyber attack against a power grid knocked out 2.2 million people's worth of energy in Ukraine. They were down for 6.5 weeks across December, right? December and January. So how warm is it outside right now? Right here? If we lose power for 6 weeks, people are going to die, right? People are going to freeze to death. I mean, this is major, major impacts. But today we do not have clear rules on what an act of war is. You go back, is it 4 years, I think, and there was an attack on a water station in Florida on the night of the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl is what everybody's watching on the news, and there was a cyber attack that made the water concentration higher in hydrogen peroxide, which made the water poisonous, right? The way it was caught was a physical valve tripped, and one of the workers had to come in and check the valve and went, holy crap, we're about to poison hundreds of thousands of people. Is that an act of war? We don't actually have those definitions right now. So part of this is it's less about how we're using artificial intelligence to be offensive, because we're also using that AI to be defensive.
Exactly.
But when do we cross the line where we've actually done something? And it's very clear in the kinetic world. In the kinetic world, you know, a tank crosses this river right here, boom, we know that's an act of war. But in the cyber world right now, I mean, we're at war pretty much every day in the real world of cybersecurity, and yet we don't know how to quantify it.
And Sean, I know Mark has to get off to go to another meeting. His avatar is not working at the other meeting, so he has to physically go to the next meeting. You want last word as you go out the door, Mark?
Yeah, Sean and I are on the same page. There's a nomenclature language issue. It's not a trivial one. The analog I would give in terms of technology causing this discussion in other areas was the advent of lasers as being useful not just as designators, as weapons, led to a Geneva Convention, as Sean doubtless knows, where it was declared as a violation of the Geneva Convention to blind other human beings using a laser. You could blind them with chemical warfare was deemed unacceptable. We still have chemical weapons with a lot of bad actors. You can kill people with lasers, you can't blind them. This is the problem we have with language and negotiations around technologies used in warfighting. I think the most important point is not what governments can do to make legal or illegal. That's not the issue. The issue is thinking about Sean's point. What our recognition of what bad actors can do with weapons, AI-enabled cyber weapons, what we can do defensively, and also what we again define as what we consider an ability to forensically determine that it was an act of war, right? As opposed to, a teenager in a basement in Georgia, and I don't mean the country, I mean the country, not the state, that is, messing around, hacking into poorly protected public infrastructure. We have a track record of that. A teenager in Georgia did that to a tram system, as Sean knows. I think it was in Poland. They derailed the train. But anyway, so we're on the same page. This is again, like the ChatGPT itself, it animates a discussion that was quiescent. Now we're back to having it. We should have it. It's important. There certainly has not been enough attention paid to the fact that the attack surface of the country has not been as much like the Civil War as any time since the Civil War. So you're right. And I appreciate the platform. Great to be on with Sean, a master practitioner and a fellow lover of history and the lessons it teaches. And I thank you too, Mark, for having me here and being the interlocutor. It's been great.
All right. Thanks for joining us, Mark. Hey, Jeremy,
thank you, Mark.
Thank you,
Mark.
schedule.
And have a great day.
You too.
Jeremy Straub, we are at the end of our time. We're mindful the next people need to tee up. So do you want to take over?
We can do that. We didn't have a chance to get any questions from folks in the room.
Oh, go ahead.
Anybody that has a burning question before as we're switching over?
Hey, one last thing, Jeremy, if I could say, someone had a great question. They asked it anonymously, and I think they're hitting something here. Sean, I hate to say it, they're directing this at you. A speaker mentioned that we just get rid of dull work, but a previous panel said that it's doing art and literature, and one company was criticized because they got rid of the illustrator because they had to use AI. So it isn't quite the dull stuff. There's some fun things going away. So they're just making a statement. So, I just want to be sure you heard that from them.
Totally agree. And I think that's a perfect question for the workforce topic.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, everybody.